Okay, class, wish I could be there with you, but obviously current situation does not allow that to happen. So today's lesson, I'm going to give this way. I'm going to move through this PowerPoint relatively quickly. So if you need to kind of catch up on something or need to pause it at any point, just go ahead and do that. And then you can kind of resume it and pick it up where it's at. Today we're talking about Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and the plan for peace at the end of World War I. So we'll go on right ahead. Our main objective today is to talk about how those European leaders and Woodrow Wilson came to a peace agreement, and we're going to talk a little bit about Wilson's plan. We'll talk about how the treaty actually ended up, and then what that meant for the country after the war. So, right into it, Woodrow Wilson's plan is called 14 points because you probably guessed it, there are 13 things he wants to accomplish. No, actually, there's 14, but uh, this is his plan that he believes is going to bring world peace. Many people call World War I the war to end all wars because they thought this would be it. And Wilson actually believed that he had a plan that would stop there from ever being war again. It has 14 different parts to it, and so that's why it's called his 14 points. So he gives a speech before Congress, tells them each of the 14 things that he's going to try to do, divides them in a couple groups, and says this is going to be it. And he expects to go to the peace negotiations and be able to say, hey, this is exactly how it should be, and then everybody's just kind of going to roll with it. The first 5 points that are part of the 14 points are meant to try to prevent a war from the future. So let's look at those in a little bit more detail first. Points 1 through 5 are supposed to prevent war from ever happening again. So point number 1 is no secret treaties. Secrets are no fun. Secrets hurt someone, and that's what Woodrow Wilson knew. So he said, no, you can't have any secret agreements between nations. You never know that's going to how this war started. All these secret treaties and agreements, and then a little conflict between two countries becomes a big war. So no secret treaties. Number 2 is complete freedom of the seas. He's thinking about unrestricted submarine warfare and those U-boat sinking things like the Lusitania. And he says, no, the seas, water is everybody's. Nobody owns the water. Nobody can own the ocean. Nobody can claim the ocean or defend the ocean. It's free to everybody. Everybody ought to be able to travel through the water as they so please. That should allow some peace or help promote peace in the world as well. Point number 3 is that tariffs or taxes should be lowered to allow free trade. All countries should be able to trade freely with each other, and there should be no tariffs and protective kind of economic barriers that would keep people from being able to trade with each other because that makes people mad, and when people get mad, they shoot each other and we have war. Number 4, arms or guns, weaponry, armaments should be reduced to what he said was the lowest point consistent with domestic safety. So the least that you could reduce them to while still being able to maintain safety for your country. What does that mean, or what is the lowest point? Well, that's part of the problem, is if you just say, yeah, as just as little as you need, then different countries are going to interpret that different ways, and so you're going to have trouble enforcing that. Finally, his last of the first 5 of those 14 points is that colonial policies should consider the interests of the colonial peoples. This goes back to imperialism. So take as an example, America and the Philippines. What he's saying is the United States should consider what the Philippines wants when they control the Philippines. This should not be a novel idea, but it is. And so they're trying to kind of scale down or peel back imperialism a little bit with point number 5. These are the main ones that he thinks this is going to set the world right. If we just do this, people will never fight again. Right, good plan. Points 6 through 13 dealt primarily with boundary changes in Europe that not only did he believe would help promote peace, but individualism throughout Europe. And so you see this map, if you compare that to the map that you colored at the beginning, looks a little bit different. And you see that Bosnia Serbia area is kind of swallowed in Yugoslavia, and Austria-Hungary is broken up, and so, some different boundary changes to make things hopefully a little bit more independent along ethnic and cultural lines. You'll see this map shows exactly who has lost the most territory, and if you look at the gold, you realize that Russia seems to have taken the biggest hit, even though they were sort of kind of on the winning side for a while at least. So these are the territorial changes, and of course Austria-Hungary has lost a great deal of territory. But point 14 was it. That's what Wilson really cared about. Point 14 was his most important. In point 14, he called for the creation of an international organization that would help to resolve conflict and problems that would arise, such as, oops, a terrorist organization killed the Archduke. How do we kind of work this out? And so the name of this organization he proposed would be the League of Nations. And countries would send a delegate to the League of Nations, and they would kind of work out these problems and discuss them and vote on them and resolve them in a peaceable way rather than going to war. This he thought was the linchpin to world peace, is that now we have this organization, there will be no need to fight anymore because everybody will work things out like we always do when we sit down at a table. And it was perhaps a little bit of pie in the sky kind of philosophy, but nevertheless, he loved this idea and he thought that this was really what was going to bring world peace forever, just like Miss America believes. So when it comes down to it, there are four major players at the Treaty of Versailles negotiations. Tons and tons of countries at the end of the war come together and participate in treaty negotiations, but really only four people matter, and these are the people seated right here. Going left to right, we have Vittorio Orlando from Italy. You've got Lloyd George from Great Britain. The third one from the left there is George Clemenceau, and then finally Woodrow Wilson of the United States. Now, here's each one of their deal. First, Woodrow Wilson, United States president. He's trying to create world peace and probably wants that to be his forever legacy, the man who brought world peace forever. As we know, that's not going to happen, but that's his goal. Number two, we've got George Clemenceau. Clemenceau is the French prime minister, and he's called the Tiger. And the reason is really all he wants is revenge. He's watched Germany march across that French border along the Rhineland there so many times in his lifetime, and he's tired of it, and he just wants Germany weak, and he wants them to pay. David Lloyd George is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he's a little bit more moderate. He understands the idea that you can't take everything out on him, but at the same time, he just got reelected with a promise that he was going to squeeze the pips out of Germany, whatever that means. And so he's kind of stuck in the middle. He understands the importance of a little bit of compromise here, but at the same time needs to deliver on punishing Germany. Finally, we've got Vittorio Orlando, who is primarily there. Italy was kind of like they were on the side of Germany at the start of the war. They decide to exit the war, and then they kind of get lured onto the Allies' side halfway through by Great Britain. And so they're there just to kind of make sure that they get what was agreed to them. They were basically told if they join Great Britain's side that they get some land. So they're there to make sure that that happens. By the way, it doesn't. So very shortly, here's how it goes. One by one, Wilson slowly has to basically compromise away each of his 14 points. He wanted all of them, but remember, none is more important than number 14. So that's his baby. He's holding strong to that last one. And so all the rest of them, he kind of has to start to compromise away because he realizes these other guys, they really want revenge, and that's what they get. Within the Treaty of Versailles, Germany's army is reduced to almost nothing. Certainly not enough to be able to fend off any invasion from anyone. Germany is also made to pay over $30 billion worth of war reparations, which one might look at this and think, well, that sounds pretty ridiculous because they just lost the war. And that's true because they did, and they don't have a lot of money lying around. Furthermore, they're supposed to assume the blame for the war. The treaty itself actually includes a part that says, oh, by the way, not that it matters, but it does because this is Germany's fault. So all of that is aimed to please Clemenceau and David Lloyd George and some of these ones that are seeking revenge. That's what Wilson has to give in order to get his last point, that League of Nations. And he does. He gets that 1 point, basically, from his original 14 points. This treaty has got all kinds of problems with it. Number one is absolutely going to humiliate Germany. And you might think, well, that's fantastic because they deserve to be humiliated. They're the enemy and whatever. But, this might lead to something else. And if you go really hard on Germany, who knows? Maybe in the future they might be really mad and they might remember this and they might try to take over the world again with an evil guy. And never mind, we'll get there. So, anyway, another part of this is this war guilt clause that we talked about. It forced Germany to take sole responsibility for starting World War I, which, if you remember, what was the spark that really started this? We talked about the main causes for war: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. But what really sparked it? It was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was from Austria-Hungary, by a Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand. Notice that Germany is not in that equation. But Germany is going to take the blame for this because they are an ally of Austria-Hungary and they kind of escalate the war. So they have to bear the complete responsibility, even though the thing that really touches off the war isn't their fault. And finally, I mean, you think about this. This is $30 billion is an astronomical amount of money now, and it is then obviously even more. And so there was no way that they were sunk, their economy was trash, and then you give them this ridiculous bill that could never be paid off. And so people aren't going to get their reparations because Germany can't pay them back. And so that's not a really good way to go about collecting your debts. But that's going to make them even angrier in the long run anyway. Germany will pay back those debts, by the way, though, and it takes them almost 100 years. Furthermore, and lastly, Russia, who, remember, they exited the war about halfway through. They were excluded from the peace conference, and they ended up losing more territory than Germany. Russia also had more casualties in the war than anybody, and they only fought for 3 years. So they're pretty sour at the end of this, even though that they were kind of on the winning side. They were originally on the winning side, so they get a pretty raw deal on all of this as well. That's another country that, who knows, maybe later somebody really angry will rise up and try to take it out on lots of people. You never know. So we get the treaty. It's called the Treaty of Versailles, and so the United States has to ratify that. They bring Woodrow Wilson comes back. He's like, "Well, I had to give up everything except for the League of Nations," and he's really proud of that. But many people thought the treaty was too harsh on Germany, not because they really had a lot of sympathy, but because when you take it out that hard on somebody, it's kind of scary. It seemed a little bit over the top. Others felt that the League of Nations, Wilson's baby, no irony there in the political cartoon, right? But what he really wanted, they thought it was a bad idea. It kept the United States involved or entangled when maybe they didn't want to be. Back to alliances being one of the causes to World War One. They thought that it takes the power out of Congress to declare war when they want to, because if the League decides they're going to go to war, then the League will all support somebody. It just they didn't like the feeling that the United States wasn't in control. They were kind of sacrificing that to a much larger um, uh, international group. And so they were very uncomfortable with that. Wilson himself is going to go out on a speaking tour to try to drum up lots of support for this. And in the middle of this, has a stroke and becomes incapacitated for the most part. Isn't even able to really carry out very many of his presidential duties. And so as a result of that, the momentum of the treaty really kind of loses steam, and the United States doesn't end up signing the Treaty of Versailles. Several other nations do, but the United States doesn't. We sign our own separate peace treaty with Germany and some of the other nations there in 1921. So for all of this, for all of Wilson's work, for his push for a League of Nations, which is established, it's established without the U.S. And there is a League of Nations, but the U.S. doesn't have a seat there. And well, actually, technically that's not true. We get a seat there, but we don't actually get to participate. It's kind of like a watching seat, a spectator seat. And so what Wilson had hoped for, his entire legacy, sadly, is just kind of a really sad ending for him, because he's kind of getting to the end there on his own. But it all kind of sort of goes away very, very quickly, and what he had dreamed to accomplish vanishes right before his eyes. So that's kind of how it ends up there. Not a really good situation, and certainly ripe for future conflict. As we know, after the war, many Americans are just shaken from what they had seen during World War I and don't want anything like that again, and are just hoping to erase life that was during the war and go back to the way things were before. It brought many changes throughout the United States. We had a strengthened military. There's no question about that. The draft provided a much stronger military. There was definitely social change for African Americans and women who have participated in different ways in the war and at home. Um, because World War War was the war to end all wars, people really didn't know what life after the war would look like, and the Treaty of Versailles did not do much to settle any of that. And there would still be continued conflict. We know that in this vacuum of power that is created in Germany, that something big is going to rise out of that: anger, resentment, and all that kind of stuff. And this is um, the kind of environment that the Treaty of Versailles created, and it leads to these problems in the future. So, by handling the end of World War One poorly, we almost guarantee World War Two. It's just going to take some time to ruminate for a little bit. As for the United States on the home front, it was a pretty good time. The United States had rallied around the war effort, and you saw that in your war agencies chart that you did the other day. Among some of those was the Food Administration, run by future President Herbert Hoover, who encouraged people to plant victory gardens, which was basically like a garden that you grew in your backyard so that you didn't have to buy produce from the supermarket. That produce, commercial produce, could be sent to the troops overseas. They also did like conservation drives like meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, where they one day a week they wouldn't eat a certain particular food, and that would help conserve some of the foodstuffs here in America. They also had the War Industries Board, which basically took all the factories or different production capabilities of the United States and mobilized that for war, so that it could produce all the ammunition and the weaponry and everything else like that was needed. They also had the Fuel Administration that encouraged energy conservation, and they're the ones that we can thank for changing those clocks back just last week. They created daylight savings time so that people would be up during daylight hours for longer, so that you didn't have to burn the lamp as much and could save fuel. And the National War Labor Board was created to help prevent strikes, so that people, it was seen as really bad form if you went on strike during the war, because you needed to help produce and everybody needed to kind of chip in, and there you are complaining about your wages. It was kind of bad form. So the National War Labor Board kind of helps work that so that people got what they needed, but didn't try to strike. And finally, there was the Committee on Public Information, or the CPI, best known probably of any of these, because they're the ones that created all the propaganda posters and Uncle Sam and We Want You and all that kind of stuff. The CPI organized all that propaganda. They organized people that would give speeches about the war and give information about the war and all kinds of things like that to drum up support for the war. So they were very active on the home front. There were a couple things that happened during the war that was probably a little bit more controversial, though. In some ways, free speech was limited by the Espionage Act of 1917. It made it illegal to help the enemy by giving false reports or interfering with the war effort at all. This could be interpreted a lot of different ways, but you really just had to be very, very careful what you said and how you said it. The Sedition Act of 1918 made it illegal to speak against the war publicly. In other words, you couldn't criticize the war. This led to more than 2,000 convictions of people who said things like, "Oh, I can't believe the president's putting us in this war. Oh gosh, this government doesn't know what they're doing." Boom. That was a violation of the Sedition Act. Obviously, that's a huge violation of free speech, but sometimes during wartime, the United States has um, made exceptions and kind of swept some things under the rug and said, well, okay, well, we're going to ignore the Constitution just for a little bit. The Espionage and Sedition Acts are two good examples of that. Furthermore, after the war, there was tremendous racial unrest. This is partly because of increased opportunities for African Americans, both in the war effort and at home on the home front, and so that creates continued more racial tension. And then and you've got race riots, particularly the Chicago riots that ended up killing 38 people, that broke out in the U.S. Right at the end of World War II. Just kind of intensified some of the situation. Life after the war was really a mess, and we'll get more into that into the 1920s. But it was a very estranged and difficult time for many Americans. One reaction that they had was a feeling of isolationism. He had gone out into the world, they had been imperialist, they had gotten out into the world, and they got burnt because they got involved in with the United States. They got involved in World War One, and not a really super pleasant experience. And so they're saying, wait a minute, imperialism was a mistake. Getting involved in all these other countries, let's completely isolate ourselves. Foreign influence, everything, keep it away, keep to ourselves. And so those feelings of nativism and isolationism emerged again after the war. And this took a form of something they call the Red Scare, because communism was an idea that was beginning to gain traction, of course, in Russia, but in some other places in the world. And the U.S. became particularly concerned about this and the spread of communism and this isolationist nativist kind of feeling would welcome something like that, a new idea, particularly a political idea that did not support freedom and democracy and all those kinds of things. Um, so one particular event touches off this Red Scare. It's called in the beginning of the 1920s. There's a series of mail bombs that are associated with a communist conspiracy that is blowing up people's mailboxes. Basically, is what it's coming down to, and it's somewhat linked to possibly a communist conspiracy. One of those bombs ended up in the mailbox of good old A. Mitchell Palmer, that's shown to your left there, that dapper fellow there. And he launches a campaign. He happens to work for the State Department. He's like, nope, not going to happen. We're going to take care of this. And he launches a campaign to root out communist conspirators and get rid of any potential communists that or conspiracies that he could find. So this becomes known as the Palmer Raids. The Palmer Raids were basically a series of raids on the Union of Russian Workers in 12 different cities throughout the United States. Initially, they arrest and deport about 270 immigrants. And then as it continues throughout the 1920s, thousands of suspects were detained. Homes and offices were searched without warrants, torn apart like you kind of see there on the right side, just destroyed, looking for possible conspiracies. Almost 1,000 immigrants were deported without hard evidence in total. Um, but basically, it was kind of it was a Red Scare. They said, well, oh, it looks like a communist, must be a communist, must be trouble, get them out of here, without a whole heck of a lot of evidence. But that was the kind of reactionary panic that was going on, and people were relatively in support of that, and so it was allowed to happen. So over 1,000 immigrants are deported based on very little evidence. 30 states themselves passed laws making it illegal to join any group that advocates any sort of revolution, and to try to put a cap on that. All right. So life after the war begins to look almost as crazy as it did during the war. There was almost more order during the war than there was after the war, as people try to figure out how to deal with all of this. And so the war left a legacy of confusion, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the 1920s and how people try to cope with this and deal with life after the war that was supposed to end all wars, and especially as all those soldiers come home. So that is the end and the close of World War One. That should be sufficient to help you get through and take that little notes quiz that is going to be in your Google Classroom. So you can go and do that, and also enough so you can get into that to finish your review sheet and everything else like that as well. So this closes up the chapter for A-Day students. The chapter test is going to be on Monday, and for B-Day students, it's going to be on Tuesday. Get that review done, get all the work done, and make sure that you're prepared so that you can do well on that. If you have any questions, please let me know, and have a great day.